I don't know if you've looked into buying a plane ticket just to move around the country in the last couple of months. They are unbelievably expensive. Tickets, particularly from Joburg to Cape Town, are now so much more expensive than they were just a year ago. In the last 12 months, we've seen a big increase in fuel prices. We've also seen the closure of the company Comair. That took 40% of our aviation industry with it. And the SAA, despite what government will tell you, is not what it used to be. Des Latham is an expert on the aviation industry. He's at Fray Intermedia. He joins us now. Des, good afternoon to you. Are the prices we're being charged now legit? I mean, can the industry really charge how much money they're charging and get away with it?
Yeah, I think because the number of factors that have taken place simultaneously. First is the fuel price, and 75% of plane costs come from fuel. So with the oil price rising because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and also OPEC now production cutting, the cost to operators has ramped up quite significantly. Second, the rand-dollar price. I mean, the rand has collapsed against the dollar in the last year, 20% or more. So we're paying immediately 20% more for our fuel, and because 75% of airlines use fuel to travel, which is their running cost basis. But you can see the maths there. Then, of course, there's a recovery from COVID, which is factoring into these costs. And thirdly, the cost of hiring people has rocketed because there are fewer skills. A lot of people went on furlough or resigned from aviation over the lockdown, the 3 years, the 2.5 years, 3 years lockdown period. So all the skills have got more expensive. So all of that to be put in one place is I think we could call the perfect storm.
Is there also a lot to do with the fact that there's just fewer seats available? Comair doesn't happen. That took 2 airlines with it, really. SAA doesn't have nearly as many planes flying as it used to. So there's just the same demand, or maybe a bit less demand, but there's a lot less capacity.
Good question. I mean, what's happened is actually almost the same demand as when we went into lockdown. So that's the system is pretty much writing itself when it comes to the demand equation. But what we're experiencing is not local. It's an international problem. I just came back from Australia this week. I was in business there for a couple of months, and you can't buy a domestic flight air ticket if you do it within 2 weeks. You just cannot find one. And if you do find one, you're going to get gouged 40 to 50% on the cost, more, and perhaps even double the cost. So around the world, we've had this. We had only in the first week of October, 7,500 flights in the US were cancelled because of a lack of planes and air crew and other problems. So the prices in the US are ramping up phenomenally at the moment. And so across the world, we're seeing this moment in time when it comes to aviation demand, where people think we in January 2019, just before the lockdown, and we're not. We're in probably February 1978, where if you flew, you had to have a lot of money back in those days. And secondly, you didn't just fly on a whim, as we got used to doing in the last decade and 15 years. Now you have to plan your flights carefully and who you're flying and where. If you want Granny to come up from Port Elizabeth for Christmas, it's too late unless you're going to pay 6,000 Rand return.
So, I mean, you raise an interesting point, because from probably the 1990s onwards, as you'll know better than I, but I mean, there was sort of deregulation of the aviation industry around the world. We went away from a model where most countries had a sort of national airline to a much sort of cut price model. I mean, you could go back to Freddie Laker in the UK from the 1970s onwards, but in South Africa, probably from the 1990s. We got used to air tickets getting cheaper and cheaper and more capacity. Has this kind of perfect storm that we're seeing now ever happened before in the aviation industry?
There have been moments in time where there's been a trim down. In 9/11, for example, when the Twin Towers were bombed, there was a collapse there. And also we've had issues in short term when it comes to volcanic eruptions, for example, where there's been a demand and a need, and airlines have had to stop operating, and then a surge afterwards. The short answer is no. Not over this period of time. We're looking at least a 2-year cycle here. We're not looking at something that's going to come back to what we experienced at the end of 2019 within a few months or a quarter or two. This is going to be extensive over the near period of time, near the short term to the medium and to the long term. Africa is only 1.9% of passenger kilometers, as we call it, worldwide, but still we're growing at 65%. There's been a growth of 65% year on year. So our region is in need of more supply, I guess. And the airlines that operate here, such as FlySafair and Airlink and Semi, are actually lining up and leasing planes rapidly. But there is still this demand, and the cost input won't change in the short term.
Okay, so the cost input won't change in the short term. Will there be more capacity? Are we seeing, I mean, I think I saw a story this week that FlySafe was adding more flights, more international flights too. I imagine that other people are looking at the demand and thinking, well, this is the moment for us to actually get in there and not just make some money maybe, but at least start to occupy more of the market.
Well, you know, this is a perfect moment for entrepreneurs to step into the picture. And aviation is not for beginners, as the SAA found out with its board, which caused the collapse of that airline. You can't just cadre deploy someone into aviation, expect it to operate. But there are players in our marketplace here who know what they're doing. And entrepreneurially, this is the perfect time to set up some kind of low-cost airline that flies local flights, twin-engine, low-operation, Embraer, which is a Brazilian bizjet-sized plane that operates with 20 or 30 people on board. The Bombardier, if you've flown to Gaborone and back, you'd have been in a twin-engine Canadair Bombardier, which is a turboprop plane. Those kind of operations that take a little longer, those planes, but they're pretty comfortable. They fly at very high altitude. They're compressed. I think that there's an opportunity here, no question about it, for people who can think fast and operate in a live manner. And I don't have any input there in terms of knowledge about it, but I would guess that there are a few people lining themselves up at the moment as we speak to deal, for example, with what's going to happen in December.
We also have, at the moment, a particular series of laws around aviation in South Africa. I think to run an airline in South Africa, a domestic airline, I think you're only allowed 25% foreign ownership. I'd need to check that, but I think that's the limit. Do we need to change that a little bit?
You know, it's a national interest. It's a black empowerment principle. It's a growth of local industry. It's science, logic, all kinds of things folded into one thing there. That's a very difficult question to answer straight up. But other than to say, my feeling is 51% controlling ownership should be sufficient. And I think to protect ourselves any more than that is counterintuitive in the modern world. We're global. Airlines don't fly from inside countries. They fly between continents. So with that in mind, you can understand that the global logic of managing these things is global. You know, the airlines you mentioned lease planes from Wells Fargo and Irish operators. They don't lease planes from local banks. They get funding, and the fuel delivery systems and the quota systems are worked out internationally, not locally. And yet when it comes to owning an airline operation here in South Africa, you've got to be 75% South African. So I just feel that needs to change. It has protected the old guard to some extent during apartheid, let alone post-apartheid. I think it is time for a change, and this is kind of a time we can do that. But I must also say very quickly that there are only a certain number of routes, and Airports Company and AT&S, which runs our air traffic controllers, can only deal with the demand of certain increase over time. So there's the other part of the equation too.
You talk about, and I mean, we can see on the screen now just how expensive some of these flights are. I mean, you're looking at 8,000 Rand from Joburg to Cape Town. I mean, that's a huge amount of money, and I'm sure I know people who have probably flown from Joburg to London for around that price in the recent past. And this takes me to my next question. Is there a particular reason why it's taking so long to sort itself out? So I would imagine there's certain bottlenecks. It probably takes, 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year to train cabin staff because they're safety operators. So you have to make sure that they actually are trained properly. I imagine it takes quite a lot longer than that to train a pilot, maybe, 4 years, 5 years? Is there any particular length of time it'll be before things get to be what we used to call normal, or does it all depend on what happens in Ukraine?
There's some limitations on flying. You can do 960 hours a year as a pilot, and you need 1,500 hours minimum to end up in the right seat, which is the first officer, not the captain. You need 3, 5, 7, 8,000 hours. And you do the maths on how many 960 hours per year limit and multiply that, and you can see we're talking about many years here. You can, there are air schools operating in South Africa, and SAA has done this in the past, where you can sign up to do, you can speed up that process, which costs R1 million for a year's training. That's on last year's prices, and I hear they've gone up again. So you're still not going to get into a situation where you have enough aircrew. You can only train maybe a couple of dozen people on that profile, and you need hundreds of pilots. So the short answer is no. This is not going to go away in the next few months or the next year. This is going to be high cost. So my advice to people is, I booked a flight to Australia. My first price on it was 40,000 Rand direct return. It went down to 27,000 Rand direct return if I gave it 3 months. So you need to think 3 months out from here. Looking at flights in March to Cape Town, 2,100 Rand return. If I'm going to book now, I'm paying if I'm going to look over December, over the surge pricing area, about that price, 6,000 to 8,000 return, you're not going to find a ticket lower than that unless you're very lucky. So what I was saying earlier about this is going back to the 70s. I was a kid then, admittedly, but I know that at the time, people didn't just think, okay, let's fly to Cape Town, let's fly to London. They would plan it for a year. And that's where we are now. You've got to think about this. And if you've got a family of 4 and you're flying to Cape Town, that's 32 to 40,000 rand return just to go and enjoy the waterfront, which is kind of insane. You may as well get in a car and drive there. You're going to pay a few thousand rand and have a lot extra to spend on the restaurants.
Desmond Latham, thank you very much indeed, Chief Operating Officer at Fray Intermedia, expert, as you can hear, on the aviation industry. It does make me wonder if maybe there's a little gap for an entrepreneur to have a very nice sort of route down from Joburg to Cape Town.